Morning and welcome to another Turnstile Tours virtual session. My name is Stefan DW, and I'm really thrilled that you're joining us today for our talk with Mary Habstritt of the Lilac Preservation Project, talking about AtoNs, aids to navigation, and buoys and lighthouses, and the lighthouse tender Lilac, which is moored over on the west side of Manhattan, down in Tribeca. I will like to say this all feels a little bit frivolous today, world events being what they are, but I hope that you still find this useful and fulfilling, and that we all stay safe and take care of one another out there and try to move together into the future. Future here is one full of more programs. We Turnstile Tours have now produced over 80 virtual sessions, pivoting to this work from our usual work of connecting people through tours in person, in cooperation and partnership with nonprofits like the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation, the Economic Development Corporation of New York City, and the Prospect Park Alliance, Brooklyn Historical Society. So we build their capacity, creating content and helping them connect with folks and helping folks connect to one another. So we pivoted to doing that online. We really appreciate each of you joining us and helping to keep our business going and put food on our tables and help us all stay together and move forward. If you've joined recent programs, particularly on Tuesdays, you've seen we've had a bit of a maritime theme going here. We're continuing that today, and we will hit that a bit more coming up. Of course, with our offices in Brooklyn Navy Yard, maritime is important to the Turnstile Tours. Next Tuesday, we're going to have Adam Green with us from Rocking the Boat. It's an organization up in the Bronx that works with at-risk youth and youth from the community, helping kids develop skills that will help them in their lives, improving people through small boats, particularly the Whitehall, which is a traditional New York craft. But tomorrow we're going to be uptown as well. We're going to be up in Harlem with the gardening center, an urban gardening center in Harlem. And then Thursday we have a conversation with, we're getting into the arts end of the world, a conversation with designer Steph Mantis, looking at pizza and process. Pizza, very important to her artwork. Friday on the waterfront again, this time hooking up with Brooklyn Historical Society, Julie Golia, who was instrumental in making the exhibit at the Brooklyn Historical Society's space in Dumbo, down under Manhattan Bridge overpass. Very popular place, that neighborhood, and she helped create an exhibit which at its core focuses on a dock worker who is in a warehouse there at the Empire Stores and was killed by a falling bag of seed. From his obituary, she uncovered his life and his relations, and a story of another person working on the docks, a regular person. And it's a fascinating tale that Julie Golia will share with us on Friday. Saturday morning, we're also doing nautical things with knots. If you saw our program a couple weeks ago with Frank Hanavan talking about knots, he's an artist and also has worked as a ship rigger with South Street Seaport Museum and with historic ships up in Maine. And so he'll be talking about more knots, getting into his 5 essential knots and some knots that'll be useful to you, as well as knots that are really specific to historic watercraft. We're also going to take trips to one of my colleagues is from Wuhan, so we'll be learning about Wuhan next week and doing some birding. Birding, of course, has both been in the news and particularly in relation to Black Lives Matter and but also, at least for me, bird Twitter has been a real escape when I need that from the overwhelming news. And we've all been more aware of nature, particularly here in New York in the early days of the pandemic. It seemed like all we heard were sirens and birdsong. So we'll be digging into birds. Lots going on. Some of you have already, especially our regular folks, have already introduced yourselves on the chat. For those of you who haven't already or are new to this Zoom format, we definitely encourage you to join the chat. Again, this is how we connect with one another in this virtual format. So just click the chat button, tell us where you're here from, and also this is a great place to ask questions. You can select all panelists and ask questions directly to the staff. Backstage we have Doug Chapman and Brian Hoffman, the firm of Chapman and Hoffman, and Doug is producing. And Brian, for those of you who would like to read an approximation of what's being said, maybe you saw our show yesterday about accessibility and are interested in seeing how closed captioning works with our projects here. Brian is typing away, trying to keep up with my rapid patter here. So that's the big picture and the scope of what we're going to do. But let's bring in Mary Habstritt and now get into the meat of what we're going to talk about with the Lilac and AIDS navigation. Hi, Mary. Unmute yourself, and there we are. Welcome. Good to see you.
Hello, everyone.
And how are things in Staten Island?
Very nice. And although the garbage got picked up in the middle of the night, it's been pretty quiet here.
Well, better than not at all. Yeah, it's quiet here in Flushing as well. So our neighborhoods definitely have that in common. So before we get into talking about AIDS navigation or AtoNs, tell us a bit about why you're talking about AtoNs. How did you get involved with this maritime work and this ship, the Lilac?
Well, I've been with the Lilac for about 10 years. Before that, I was working as a preservation advocate and industrial historian, often trying to rescue places that just before they got knocked down. Places like the Domino Sugar Refinery in Brooklyn. And so this is one of a very small handful of steam-powered ships that still survive. And
the Lilac, that is.
Yes, the Lilac, yeah. Yes. And the people who had started the nonprofit that own her were mainly interested in the steam. And I was attracted to the fact that it was a steamship, but also that no one was trying to sink it compared to all the buildings I'd been trying to save. It seemed like something that I could win at for once. So I joined the team, and by the time we moved to Pier 25 in Tribeca and started having regular hours where we were open to the public.
Now, I see that Laura May has joined us and says that Laura May is involved in Ship 24 on the island. Does that mean something to you, or do we need more information from Laura May about Ship 24? I would love to know more about Ship 24.
I don't know about Ship 24.
Well, Laura May, tell us more about Ship 24. And something with the word ship in it that I'm unfamiliar with. It's definitely something I want to know more about. So we'll look forward to that update in the chat. Great. Let's do. Would you like to go into our slides and see the story that we have to tell there?
Sure.
All right, let's do that. Hang on a second. There we go.
And I'd like to say I don't consider myself an expert on buoys. I'm an expert on the ship, I think, by now, after 10 years. And I actually do welcome questions. And if I don't know the answer, just as when I'm leading a live tour on board, I take that question and I go to people who are more expert, or my reference library, or an online search, and I seek the answer so that I can answer questions better in the future. So happy to get questions from you as we go along here.
And it looks like we got a follow-up from Laura May saying that it's a Sea Scout ship. And so yeah, tell us where that's based. I know there's one over in, I think, New Brunswick, New Jersey has a Sea Scout ship. But yeah, big fan of the Sea Scouts. They do great work. And I would love to reach out to us, please, Laura May, and we'll love to talk more about that. But let's get into the Lilac here.
Yes, so starting at the beginning, the U.S. Lighthouse tender was built for the U.S. Lighthouse Service and launched on May 26, 1933. So we just celebrated her 87th birthday. She got some new rivets on her birthday, by the way. She's the oldest and the most intact lighthouse tender of only 3 that were built for the Lighthouse Service that still survive. The Lighthouse Service was a civilian agency of the federal government that was dedicated to maintaining all the aids to navigation, not just lighthouses, but also buoys, range lights, and other markers on our waterways. And even with GPS, this system's still in use today to help everyone from recreational boaters to commercial vessels to cruise and cargo ships to find their way safely through our nation's coastal waters.
So so today they look a little bit different. We have a Coast Guard cutter that operates in New York Harbor today, right?
Yes, it's a little bit bigger. Lilac's 174 and a half feet long, and the Catherine Walker, our current buoy tender, is 180 feet. But the outline is very similar. There's a big open foredeck for handling buoys with a boom or crane for lifting them. And so the profile is pretty distinctive. You'll recognize the Catherine Walker as she moves around the harbor. And as you might guess, if you know about Catherine Walker here in New York, especially if you're from Staten Island, she was a lighthouse keeper at the Robbins Reef Lighthouse in New York Harbor.
We did a program all about her just, was that a week or 2 ago now, that with Noble Maritime Collection, which is slowly restoring that lighthouse.
Yes, and so the current class of this coastal buoy tender is named for lighthouse keepers. She's not the only one. And in the days when Lilac was launched, all the lighthouse tenders were named for flowers and trees. So there was one named the tulip, one named the mistletoe. Lilac's sister ship, the Arbutus, worked here on New York Harbor, where Lilac worked in Delaware Bay.
So it sounds like, Arbutus, I don't think of as a tree associated with New York. I'm sort of curious about how it got that name. But and you said about the profile. So with Catherine Walker, that boat has that similar, and we're looking here at this picture, and there's a very high foredeck, and then it drops way down almost to the waterline right before the mast. And is that also true of Catherine Walker today?
It is, yes. And you'll notice the side there is open.
Yeah, so right before it says Coast Guard in this space in here,
exactly. Yeah. And I have not seen a picture yet where that was closed, but there was a removable section of the bulwark there that could be lifted out with the boom. And veterans who visited the ship have told me they've never seen them in place. When we got the ship, of course, they put everything back together, so those removable sections were in place. But you can also imagine, though, a ship running around like that with the sides wide open and people working on the deck, that was not the safest place to work.
Yeah, I imagine they saw some wash in heavy weather.
Yes, yes. And we'll see a little bit of that later. You saw the last slide that she had the Coast Guard logo and Coast Guard name on. The Lighthouse Service was disbanded in 1939, and all its duties were transferred to the Coast Guard. And then Lilac became known as a Coast Guard cutter. She was still doing the same job, but the Coast Guard refers to all its larger vessels as cutters in honor of the Revenue Cutter Service.
That's so interesting, right? Because a cutter it's like a sloop, but it has 2 foresails, if I'm not mistaken, right?
The first ones, yes. Although it basically was a fast ship that could cut off another ship. And Alexander Hamilton, our Secretary of the Treasury in 1790, realized that one of our sources of revenue as a new country was we needed to make sure that ships bringing cargo to our ports would pay customs duties. So he asked Congress for funding for a fleet of essentially police ships. That was the Revenue Marine, and it later became the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard is very proud of staying in service that whole period of time from 1790.
Wow.
It's longer than the Navy's been in existence because our Revolutionary Navy was disbanded for a while. When we went into the War of 1812, we didn't have any Navy vessels. The Coast Guard served as the Federal Navy for a while.
Wow. But we see a very different looking ship here. What happened?
Right. So, and we were just talking about war. In wartime, the Coast Guard actually comes under command of the Navy. This is Lilac in World War II. She was painted gray to camouflage her, and she had armaments added. You might be able to point at the big gun on her bow.
Yeah.
3-inch.
Right here, is that what we're looking at?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes. And the forecastle had to be reinforced to support that gun. There are also 2 anti-aircraft guns on the roof at the back.
Is that what we're seeing back in this neck of the woods?
Little pointy things. They're covered with canvas.
Got it.
She had sonar to keep an eye out for U-boats. They were very concerned about attacks from U-boats on Delaware Bay. Over 1/3 of our ships that supported the war effort were being built in the Philadelphia area. And there were actually a number of attacks by U-boats as ships came out of the Delaware River out into the Atlantic. There were at least 18 ships sunk by U-boats. So it was very important to have for the Navy to have assistance protecting the coast. And Lilac still did her duties of tending lighthouses and buoys because it was even more important that those were working to guide our ships safely out to sea.
Yeah, in some places, do I recall correctly that there were some places where buoys were removed to sort of to forestall enemy invasion, but it sounds like that wasn't something we did here, or there were minefields added, of course. What do you know about those sort of operations in time of war?
I don't know about removing buoys. I wouldn't be surprised that there would have been attempts to make sure that we weren't helping the enemy to find us. One thing that Lilac had added that I hadn't mentioned yet was she had an anti-mine system called degaussing gear. And there's a copper cable that runs all around the inside of the hull to actually change the magnetic signature of the hull, because mines could actually detect a steel hull passing by and be triggered by that ship going by. They could electrify this copper coil and actually keep the ship from being detected. It was like a cloaking device.
Wow. Is there evidence in the structure of the ship from those adaptations?
Yeah, the ship's very intact. Obviously, it changed many times over the years she was in service. And part of what we talk to people about when we do tours is the physical remains of all those upgrades. You can see how technology changed over the 40 years that she was in service. And there's still a sonar box on the bridge that was added for World War II. There's still gauges for that degaussing system that you can see on the bridge.
Wow.
Yes.
Huh. I know I got to know the lightship in Seattle that's known as Swiftsure. And I don't know if this was true of Ambrose, our local lightship, and we'll get into lightships later, I'm sure, but with Swiftsure, they had guns mounted on that ship, and the guns were so heavy, they changed the structure of the ship. They tried to reinforce below, but you can still see where the weight of the gun left a mark on the ship.
Yes, and in our article, you can see lots of additional columns and beams to support that big gun on the front, and portholes that were welded shut. You can still see the outline.
Wow.
So actually quite a few changes made.
All right, now we're back to more traditional livery here.
Yes, this is from the 1950s. We have been collecting photos from our veterans, and this is from the son of one of Lilac's commanding officers. So here she's tending to the Brandywine Shoal Lighthouse. Lilac was assigned to the 4th Lighthouse District, and originally she was based in Edgemoor, Delaware, right outside of Wilmington, where she was built. And later on, after World War II, she was based in Gloucester City, New Jersey. which is on the other side of the Delaware River from South Philadelphia. But she served aids to navigation all through Delaware Bay and north on the Delaware River as far as Trenton, New Jersey. During her years of service, most of the lighthouses had keepers that lived on site, often with their families. They had to be there all the time to make sure that the light was always working and to turn the foghorns on when weather was bad. And then tenders like Lilac were the ones that brought supplies to them and helped with major repairs. Sometimes there was some big repair to the lighthouse that the keeper couldn't do himself, and the tender was a mobile workshop. They moved keepers in and out when they changed over, and they also brought inspectors out there to make sure everything was working right.
Now, this is called Brandywine Shoal, and that brings up an interesting point that lighthouses. I think you talk about this in a minute, but lighthouses are built to identify hazards, or as well as identifying channels, or as its navigation are. So, often, like the Robbins Reef here in New York Harbor is on a very shallow place. It's very difficult to get a boat close to Robbins Reef. What was the draft on, and how was Lilac able to get close to all the lighthouses?
In most cases, she could. She was intentionally built with a shallow draft. When she was fully loaded with fuel and other supplies, she had a draft of about 11 feet at the stern, and the bow would have ridden a little bit higher. So it could get into pretty shallow places, probably as shallow as 9 feet or so.
Wow.
But she also carried 2 small boats on what we call the boat deck, so that she could get up to even more shallow areas.
Got it.
So the tenders brought everything that the keepers needed, and that included even boxes of library books that traveled around. I always like to mention that because I had an earlier career as a librarian. But these lighthouses out on rocky points like Robbins Reef or Brandywine Shoal, where it was very shallow, could only be reached by boat. There wasn't any other way to get supplies there. And in this case, Lilac is bringing fresh water and fuel to the Ship John Shoal Lighthouse. And you can see there's 2 tanks there with Lilac crew members sitting on tops with hoses in place to resupply the lighthouse with water and fuel. And something I was surprised to learn early on, although it makes perfect sense, I just hadn't thought about it, is that these lighthouses that are surrounded by salt water need to have fresh water brought to them.
Yes, they do.
Yes. They typically have cisterns to catch rainwater, but that isn't always enough to sustain the crew at the lighthouse. So that is one of the important things that the tender would bring to them.
Yeah, it's a big challenge with the restoration of the lighthouse in New York Harbor, the Robbins Reef, is how do you get fresh water out there, whether you're blasting paint off or anything else. That's and ships too. We talk about that with the lighters, the lighterage barges, and people living on board boats, and how do they get water if they're moving around the harbor all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing is the tenders never were away from their dock for very long. They'd usually be out for a matter of a few days. So they had tanks all through the ship along the hull. So they could typically carry anything they needed to and then get resupplied when they got back to the dock. So this is a lighthouse I have not yet identified. The photo is from one of our veterans. He was a chief boatswain's mate, so he ran all the deck operations back in the 1950s. But lighthouses have more than one job. They are, like we talked a little bit about, warning ships away from places that are dangerous for them to go, where it's rocky or it's very shallow, where they might get hung up on a shoal. But they also help ships to know where they are. And every lighthouse is different, both with the light at night and also with the way they look in the daytime. So at night, the frequency of the light and the height of the tower is marked on charts, and it can help a ship identify their location. During the day, they are either painted with a distinctive pattern. Some of the larger ones, a very famous one on Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, black and white swirled stripes. It's the only one painted that way. Everyone is a little different. A lot of them are painted white for visibility, but the height and the shape of the lighthouse is going to be unique. And that's so that the ship can figure out where it is on the earth.
And you can be in a lot of trouble if you think it's the wrong light. That, which in the record seems to have happened not infrequently around New York, where people thought they were looking at one light, were looking at a different one, and that's often integrated into the stories of shipwrecks. And you know, I've read a lot of the legal cases where, or I think one that stands out in my mind associated with another one of our historic ships here in New York, the Portside New York, and the Mary Whalen, which was involved in a case that went to the Supreme Court. And there was a question of whether the buoy near the shoal that it ended up on was lit or not. And if I recall correctly, it was not functioning, but they had to prove that in order to, you know, put liability where it belonged.
Right. I think it was mainly related to who pays and the insurance settlement. But yes.
Always a big question around boats.
Right. We talked a little bit about lighthouses now. Light ships, as the one you see here, is basically a floating lighthouse. Light ships were anchored in places where the land wasn't firm enough, or there wasn't enough to support a lighthouse building. And often the light ships were moored at barrier islands or sandbars where it shifted and changed. But like the keepers in a lighthouse, the crew in a light ship couldn't leave. It always had to be staff. There always had to be someone there to make sure the light was on and the foghorn was working when it needed to be. So like lighthouses, light ships were served by tenders, and the tenders brought them their mail, which is something that shows up in a lovely children's book called Lightship by Brian Floca.
I was going to mention Brian Floca's book. I love that book. It's if you need to get a child to sleep, there's nothing like Brian Floca's Lightship with its refrain of, was it the lightship holds its place or something like that?
Lightship holds its place. And I think you might wake the kid up when you sound the foghorn, though. There's one case, I've read it for children's story hours. Be-oo. But it is a great book, and there's a page where the tender, and it actually has Lilac's hull number on it, even though she never worked on New York Harbor, is bringing the mail to the Ambrose. So it's a favorite of ours.
I had not noticed that. Thank you for mentioning that. That's lovely.
So in the case of light ships, quite a few of them survive compared to lighthouse tenders. They're not used anymore. They've all been replaced normally by just a steel framework with a light on top, because ships still need to be warned away from those places. But those obviously are less costly. They don't need a crew. But many of the ships are museums or historic sites. This one that's painted with the name Overfalls is in Lewis, Delaware.
That's very specific. You said painted with the name Overfalls. Does that mean it wasn't the Overfalls lightship all the time?
Right. I believe the Ambrose at South Street Seaport was never actually anchored on the Ambrose shoals either. But they often would bring a replacement, a relief ship out, and then take a ship away for servicing, and they move them around quite often. And that's reflected in the fact that there's 3 light ships that survive with the name Nantucket on the side.
Yeah, yeah.
But they were typically named for the shoals that they marked. So Nantucket is notorious as a graveyard of ships, very shallow, and it's at the main entrance to America when you're coming from the Atlantic. But there are 17 of these vessels that survive in the US and a few more in other countries. And we're lucky to have 2 right in New York City. We've mentioned the Ambrose at South Street Seaport. There's also the Frying Pan at Pier 66 Maritime on the Hudson River.
Which is also not a New York ship, right?
No, the Frying Pan shoals are off North Carolina. It's not called the Frying Pan because it's more to a bar and grill. And there's another one just across the Hudson River in Jersey City at a marina that they use as a clubhouse for a yacht club.
Do you know if they ever pulled the one out of Erie Basin? That's... did I freeze? You
froze. I didn't.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Do you know if they ever pulled the one out of Erie Basin that sank over there in Red Hook?
I have not really tracked that down. It did disappear. It's definitely not there anymore. It was, I think, when IKEA went into the site out there, but I don't know what happened to that.
We had a question. I want to finish talking about lightships for a minute, but we did have a question from Howard about how many people crewed the Lilac?
Well, I think it's a wartime peak. But we have documentation indicating there were as many as 38.
Wow.
We actually have quite extensive spaces for the crew and officers. And it was very hierarchical. On the upper deck, there are small individual staterooms for the administrative level of officers. And you go down a deck at the stern, and the chief petty officers have a room that 3 shared with their own bathroom or head. And then one more level down, the petty officers are down in a much darker space, down in the hull at the stern. But still fairly comfortable because all the action when the ship was moving through the water was at the bow. So at the bow is where the sailors slept, way down in the hull. And one of the things Lilac had to do many times to get to buoys and lighthouses in the winter was break ice. And wow. Try to imagine sleeping as this steel hull that you're right up against in your bunk goes bashing through ice down the river.
I mean, I've experienced going through ice on the Staten Island Ferry, and that is a tremendous sound. And that's not solid ice. Those are just chunks they happen to be hitting in very cold winters.
And but one of our veterans remembers getting thrown out of his bunk.
Wow.
So it was not just loud, but it was quite a shakeup.
Wow. But back to lightships. What were you saying about lightships?
I think that's all I have to say about it. Let's move on to buoys. They're less romantic than lighthouses, less visible than lightships, but equally vital to navigation. And probably the buoys that we're most familiar with are the red and green ones that mark the main channels that ships move through. It's a main channel like that going into a major port like New York or Philadelphia is going to be deep enough for any ship to go. So they'll know that between the red and green buoys, they'll be safe. And there are a lot of different kinds of buoys.
Wow.
These are just some of them. Lots of different shapes and sizes, and the technology, of course, changed over decades also. So the size and shape depends on their location and purpose and how far away a ship needs to see them in order to change course in time. So bigger buoys are further out near the entrances to rivers as ships are coming in from across the sea and help them find the entrance to the harbor. Smaller ones do not have lights. They all typically have some kind of sound signal in addition, sort of like the foghorn on a lighthouse, so that you can hear where they are at night or in bad weather. The smaller ones typically have something mechanical, that a gong or a bell that will ring with the motion of the waves as the buoy bounces around.
My favorite aspects of the harbor, the sound of those buoys. That's just
Yes, we
Beautiful.
have a great film screened on Lilac called Bell 8 that incorporated the sounds of a buoy out on Long Island Sound.
Uh,
But you can even see from the labels here, some of them have whistles, some of them have radar reflectors so that ships can pick them up with their radar. So there's a lot of redundancy. They're both meant to be detected visually in the daytime and audibly after dark. And with the larger ones, of course, they also have lights on for after dark.
and when did they first get lights on buoys? It seems like a really radical technology.
Yes, and I did just look at that date, and I'm forgetting it at the moment, but it was in the 19th century already. And
Wow.
the first experiment of electrical lights for the buoys was actually on New York Harbor. And they ran a cable, an electrical cable from Sandy Hook to a system of experimental buoys that they tried lighting that way. But ships kept snagging the cable, and it caused a lot of problems keeping those lights lit. It just wasn't dependable. So they scrapped that for the time being. They used different kinds of gas for many years to light them. And that caused danger for the tender crews. Even though gas was quite reliable, and they didn't have to check it really often because there was a reservoir in the buoy to hold the gas, which was pressurized.
Wow.
But because it was pressurized, when they're testing it and refilling those tanks on the buoys, there was quite a danger of explosion or fire, and a number of crew members from tenders were injured or lost their lives just tending the gas buoys. So electricity was much safer. They eventually went to using batteries. So one of the jobs Lilac had was changing batteries, as well as obviously the light bulbs. Now, most of them are solar powered, so they don't need to get serviced quite as often, but they still do get checked on a routine basis at least once a year.
Wow.
Here you can see a little bit more about how this system of buoys works. There's a mnemonic that mariners use, red right returning, and that's to remind you that as you're heading into port, you want the red buoys on the right side. That's the starboard side of your ship. And if you keep the buoys on that side of the ship, you'll know that you're going the right direction to get to port. And another clue is the numbers themselves, because I want to make sure I get this right. I'm not a mariner myself, so I learn a lot of this as I go, I have to tell you. But the numbers also tell you which buoy you're looking at. And so like the lighthouses, you can figure out your location by checking the charts for the color and the number of the buoy.
And the numbers rise as you come inland, isn't that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I know when I was first getting into boats and boating, it was made very clear to me that they made sure that I understood that you never touch or moor on a buoy. It's okay for sea lions and seals, but unless you're a buoy tender, you should not be touching buoys as pleasure boaters.
Right, and the red buoys have even numbers, the green ones have odd numbers. And as you said, they increase as you head inland. So this is giving you a lot of guidance to make sure you're going the right way and to help you know where you are. There are other kinds of buoys that mark the junction of channels and let you know there's others that let you know there's clear water on both sides. In this case, when you're staying in between the red and green buoys, there might be really shallow, dangerous water just outside that lane of traffic or channel. So you want to stay between the buoys. And black ones that mark dangerous spots. So the colors and the numbers and the letters are very important, and they need to be clear. So one of the jobs of tenders is to keep them painted. And here you'll see the crew on the Lilac painting a buoy. The readability is critical, and the paint also helps prevent corrosion. They're typically made of steel even today. The Coast Guard is starting to switch over to foam buoys. They're made of a
Really? Wow.
foam.
Huh, I had no idea.
To reduce maintenance.
Yeah.
So,
Is that a buoy, that black thing?
yeah, yeah. And there's actually 2 photos of this buoy in the collection of slides that this is taken from. So I suspect it's because it was a particularly ancient one. But the main thing here is to see that what it's covered in, because when they pull a buoy out of the water, it's had time to accumulate a lot of underwater growth. It's all slimy and slippery, which makes the job of handling it more dangerous. But one of the bonuses is that you can eat mussels off of the buoys, which I've heard several stories from our veterans from Lilac that they did that. In fact, one of our veterans grew up in Arizona, and the first seafood he ever had was mussels off of a buoy.
That's fantastic.
And
this is so impressive. The scale of buoys is all mystifying because there's nothing near them to really get a sense of scale. You know, I've seen there's this incredible video of sea lions on a buoy, and a sailboat comes next to it, and the sea lions look like the size of the sailboat. You know, they get huge, but you know, 2 things we don't know their scale because we don't encounter them very often, and they can be deceptively large.
Right, and that's the reason I like this photo and use it quite often as part of our educational tours, because it's so great at showing the scale. This is one of the largest buoys that Lilac could lift. In this case, she's setting it down in the water. Probably the one on deck you can see off the edge of the photo is the one she pulled out and they were replacing. We've calculated this buoy by itself weighed about 18,000 pounds, and then with the chain and the sinker that anchored it in place, it probably was about 38,000 pounds altogether, which is very close to the limit of Lilac's lifting capacity.
Wow.
The buoy is rated for 40,000 pounds.
It's interesting. It says number 19 on it, and it almost looks like it might be different colors. So if that's the case, it suggests that it's at a division in channels and it's fairly far in, but it looks like open water all around it. It's really pretty remarkable.
Yes, and I have not tracked where these individual buoys sat, but like we just talked about, the numbers get bigger as you head upriver or toward the port. So that was a number 1. So it would have been near the entrance to, 19, sorry.
Yeah.
And, but obviously it's a very large one, so it's meant for ships to see it from pretty far away. One of the jobs of the tenders is to remove ice from buoys. One of the interesting things is they're calculated to be seen from a certain distance, which is dependent on how tall they are, but also what level they're sitting at in the water. And so if ice is weighing them down, they can be too low in the water for the ships to recognize them at the right moment to change course. So
do you know what distance it is that they're calculating, or is the distance different for different buoys, or can you tell us more about that?
Well, the Coast Guard did standardize buoys, particularly after World War II. So there are standard sizes, but their position and size are chosen for a particular spot.
Gotcha. Well, that's. And when do you think this? I mean, I'm really struck by the shape of this buoy and particularly the light on top. But do you know the date on this particularly?
Just based on the set of slides it came from, it would have been in the late 1950s.
Wow.
And they were using steam from Lilac's boilers to melt the ice off. So that cloud of steam you saw was because they were aiming a steam hose at the ice.
Wow.
And they also had to repair the steel when the buoys got damaged. And even though they're signposts and ships are meant to be watching for them, they do get run into. I mean, you can compare it to the signs you see on the street that have gotten knocked over by trucks and cars. So this one got banged up a bit, and they brought it on board to repair it. There's welding equipment. There's a cabinet right on the buoy deck to hold welding equipment. And they also had navigational equipment then on the bridge to help them reset the buoy in the right spot. Because if a buoy's been moved by being hit by a ship or ice pushing it downriver when the ice breaks up in the spring, or a storm can push it away or break the chain, they have to get it back in the right spot or it's not doing its job. So they had ways to triangulate positions by using their gyro compasses and sextants. Because when Lilac was working, it was all before GPS. They do use GPS now to get them in the right spot.
Another great sense of the scale of these things and sort of their iceberg aspect of having so much below the water.
Right, and also you can see that this is a supply of surplus buoys at Lilac's home port in Gloucester City, New Jersey, and they kept a variety of sizes on hand so that they would have a replacement if one washed away entirely. There is a story about, I don't remember where it started out from on our side of the Atlantic, but there was an American buoy that washed up in Ireland once.
Wow.
So, you know, sometimes they can't be retrieved or they can't be repaired, or it's going to take more time. They need to have something in that spot because they need to keep ships safe. So they have spare ones that they can take out and put in place. And this building still.
We're getting to our last few minutes here, but we've got a few more photos I want to look at. So let's see what we have here.
So I mentioned the sinkers. This is a sinker that would hold a buoy in place. It's just a big concrete block, easy to replace. If a buoy breaks free and it gets left on the bottom, they can just cast another one back at the base because it's just a big block of concrete with an iron bar and a loop on the top.
So there may be a small collection of sinkers from that have been cut from their buoys wherever buoys are stationed.
Probably a lot of them.
Oh, wow. Look at this weather. That ice is incredible.
Yeah, and that's what this is all about, is the tenders had to go out in any kind of weather because if those aids to navigation aren't working, other ships are endangered, and so they're out there all the time whenever they need to be. And this is a particular instance, and I got the photos from one veteran and the story from another, but I ran into this buoy and hard enough that they got locked together. And while they were waiting for Lilac to show up, everything got covered in ice. The crew on the tug was very concerned that once they were cut free from the buoy, the tugboat would capsize because there was so much ice on her superstructure. So they were banging away.
Wow.
With whatever tools they could find. And then to free the buoy from the tug, Lilac hung one of their bosun's mates over the side with a cutting torch and some crew members held him by his feet, and he just hung down over the side and cut the buoy free.
That's terrifying.
Yes.
And you said that Lilac used steam from its steam plant, from its boiler, to melt ice. We don't have steam-powered tenders anymore. Do you know what they do to remove ice today?
I do not. I will have to find the captain of the Catherine Walker.
I love that plan, unless the Catherine Walker captain happens to be out there watching today, which would be lovely, but say hello if you are.
And we talked about buoys getting run over and hit. Lighthouses sometimes were also hit. This is the aftermath. Lilac went to respond after the ore carrier Steel Apprentice ran into the elbow of Cross Ledge Light. And this lighthouse was very close to the main channel and had been hit quite a few times before, where it said that the crew that kept the light actually slept in their life jackets. It had been hit so often. Fortunately, by this point, when this very hard collision happened, there weren't any crew there anymore. It had been automated already.
Yeah, when you were talking about buoys getting hit, I immediately thought of the Ambrose, the lightship that was out there famously at one point. My understanding is the ships, because it had a radio signal, that ships would home in on that radio signal and use it to guide them in, because it was marking a channel, something you want to go to rather than something you want to avoid. And at least once, an ocean liner cut the Ambrose in half because they didn't veer away and just kept right on aiming for that radio signal. I don't know if that was a problem for buoys or lighthouses that had radio signals as well.
Yes, and what happened in this case was the ship lost its radar.
Oh, wow.
And in very heavy fog, so they could not see the lighthouse up ahead or sense it with any of their equipment. So couldn't see it in any way, shape, or form. I have heard that story about the Ambrose. It's partly why there's a light tower there instead of a ship. So we're getting to the end of Lilac's active duty here. She was decommissioned in a ceremony in 1972 at the Curtis Bay Shipyard. The Coast Guard has its own shipyard in Curtis Bay, Maryland. And after that, the Coast Guard donated her to the Seafarers International Union, and she served as an employee dormitory at a school for merchant mariners, also in Maryland. And in about 1984, she went into private ownership. Guy who owned a marina in Virginia was renting some of the ship out as a real estate office and selling equipment off of the bridge. So even though the ship's very intact, we had to replace a fair bit of the bridge equipment by salvaging it from other ships. And our nonprofit has owned it since 2003. She's been open to the public since 2010 at Pier 25. Normally we're open weekend afternoons from May to October, and obviously that's not the case right now, but I hope that we can all welcome you aboard someday soon.
And you do a lot of interesting programs. You've had in the past a relationship with the River Project. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the River Project is an environmental nonprofit, and we the ship used to be at Pier 40, which is also where they're located in Hudson River Park. And so we've been partners for a long time, longer than my tenure at Lilac. I think it must be about 15 years. And they have traps hanging from Lilac for research and educational purposes. And oyster baskets. They're raising oysters on Lilac. And one of the great things about having them attached to a ship is the baskets and traps stay in the same level in the water column.
Huh.
So that supports the research. You know, the ship's not going to come out of the water, and like if you have baskets tied to a pier with the rise and fall of the tide, they might be exposed.
Right, we have that at the Waterfront Museum, has oyster test cages, and on very low tides, there's one of them that comes right out of the water.
Yeah. So one of the great things for us, because we're very limited on staffing resources, is that by allowing them in and having a partnership, is we bring almost 1,000 school children a year in to learn about what's swimming below the surface of the Hudson River. They pull the traps up, bring school children on board. Some city kids are getting their hands muddy for the first time.
And touching the water around them, which they've been told their whole lives is gross and poisonous and they shouldn't go there.
Yes.
That's fantastic. Yeah, there's such a great organization. I love their release of the fishes in the fall and sort of welcoming the fishes in the spring, and all the research they've been doing, tracking the animals in the organisms in the harbor in the Hudson for such a long time. It's just I hope more folks are inspired by them and by your work as well to do similar things. We do have a couple of questions here, which I'm getting coming in. Are there ways for groups to get involved with these projects, whether it's with Lilac is probably what you can best speak to. How do people get involved if they want to know more?
Well, you can sign up to be a volunteer on our website, which puts you on our mailing list. We have a sub list specifically for volunteers. And I put out a note about once a week that says, here's what's happening. And I will say that even during the pandemic, we've had a small skeleton crew working away every Sunday in masks and gloves, doing restoration work on the ship. When we're open to the public, volunteers also help by greeting visitors and acting as tour guides. That part of our volunteering corps is quiet right now.
And then a really essential question, Barbara has a great point here. How did Lilac escape conversion to diesel? Why is it still steam?
Well, I think what saved the steam engines is the way she ended up being used after decommissioning. The Seafarers International Union had no reason, there still were a lot of steamships around, but they weren't training young cadets to work on steamships. They were training them to work on diesel-powered ships. And so they didn't use Lilac as a training ship to teach about steam. They just wanted it as floating building, basically. And that helped preserve the engines. And I think if that marina owner in Virginia had found a buyer and he marketed Lilac for a long time, anyone who wanted to operate the ship would have converted it to diesel, but that just didn't happen. It was somewhat accidental.
Well, and as I understand, your steam engine is not currently functional. Is that correct?
We are not able to fire up the boilers yet to make steam, but the engines do turn over.
That's fantastic. Well, hopefully your work will, Mary wants to know, when are we going to bring the maple to NYC? I imagine that's
Oh, Brad's from Wisconsin. That's why he's asking. The maple is one of those 3 lighthouse tenders from the Lighthouse Service days that still survive. And the maple is one that was built specifically for Great Lakes service. So it's always been in fresh water, which is really good for its steel hull. It was built with diesels from the beginning. Right now, the owner seems to have sort of abandoned the project of doing anything with it. I've seen pictures of her covered in graffiti. But, that was just a tweak. We aren't actually planning to bring her here unless Brad has plans I don't know about.
Yeah, Brad, let us know how your fundraising goes with that, and we'll bring you on to talk about it. Brad, who talked with us about the Gowanus. All right, we're about out of time. Thank you so much, Mary. I know we'll be sharing links and information, connecting people to you in the email that goes out after this. It's good to see you, and we'll look forward to keeping up with all that you do as we move past back into some semblance of normal. So thank you again. We'll see you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
And for everyone else, again, remember tomorrow we have gardening up in Harlem with the Urban Garden Center. Thursday, conversation with designer Steph Mantis, who does things with pizza. And Friday, back in the waterfront workers finding the Harkins family with Julie Golia, looking at a guy who died working in a warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront. Not tying on Saturday morning with Frank Hennevan, and then Rocking the Boat will be with us on Tuesday. We have a lot of great programs coming up. You know where to find them. We'll look forward to seeing you there. Have a great day, everyone. Please stay safe.